It's Tuesday, it's 12:15, and we're live at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. Joining me, Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth and Spectator Assistant Editor Isabel Hartman. This was the scene last night here in Brighton. A member of the Shadow Cabinet resigns, claiming the party is more divided than ever.
We've got a major conference, possibly within 18 months of a general election, and to be honest, the conference is falling apart.
With the rule changes Keir Starmer has put through, that he really is absolutely leading the Labour Party.
How serious is this for Keir Starmer's leadership? He'd rather be talking about the party getting tough on crime. And queues at the petrol pumps are a big challenge for ministers. Is the opposition cutting through? Let's start with the resignation of the Shadow Cabinet Minister, former now, Andy McDonald. Labour members will vote later on as to whether the party would increase the minimum wage to £15 an hour if it wins power. Yesterday afternoon, Andy McDonald quit as Shadow Employment Secretary, saying opposition to the idea from the party leadership is the reason he resigned. Now, his resignation letter to Keir Starmer is pretty stinging in its tone and content. Let's just read you this part of it. I joined your front bench team on the basis of the pledges you made in the leadership campaign to bring about unity within the party and maintain our commitment to socialist policies. He goes on to say, after 18 months of your leadership, our movement is more divided than ever, and the pledges that you made to the membership are not being honoured. Jonathan Ashworth, is he right? Is the Labour Party more divided than ever?
No, I disagree with Andy. I'm very sorry to see Andy go. I've always respected Andy, got on extremely well with Andy, always valued his insights, his contribution, and I consider him a friend. I obviously disagree with him, but, you know, I understand his, you know, I respect him for his sincerely held views, but I don't think this is a party divided. We are a party talking today about the future of the National Health Service, how I want to create the conditions to give every child the healthiest start in life, and how I want to double investment in dementia research, because there's no cure for dementia. I make those points not to avoid the question, but to make a broader point that we are focusing on policies which will change the lives of people.
But you couldn't bring Andy McDonald, a key member of your team, a former key member of your team, on board. That does point to division. And actually, it seemed to take you and some of your colleagues completely by surprise.
Well, I mean, it took me by surprise, but, you know, that's politics. But I think, in the end, this conference will be remembered not for Andy's resignation, and I don't say that with any sense of, you know, trying to sort of put him down. It's just, but I do say that respectfully. I think in the end, this conference will be remembered for us getting on the front foot about the policies that matter to the British people.
Right, it's quite something though, Isabel, isn't it, for a key member of your team to resign right in the middle of the annual party conference?
Yeah, it's quite rare to have a Shadow Cabinet resignation in the middle of party conference, and it's also inconvenient because it does distract from the policies that Labour is trying to talk about. I don't think there's any great mourning within Sir Keir Starmer's team that Andy McDonald has gone. I don't think he was seen as one of their key thinkers, to be fair. And I also, I mean, you know, there's been some suggestion that he's trying to sabotage conference, that he also had backed the party's work policy that they unveiled at the weekend. So there's sort of a bit, you know, why go now? But it is, you know, it's a distraction from what messages they are trying to get across. It's not helpful.
Do you think it was a coordinated attack, part of a coordinated attack on the leadership?
Oh, look, I mean, look, I've got absolutely no idea whatsoever on that front. What I would say, though, is that some of my colleagues who say the conference is falling apart, that
well, that's John McDonald, the former Shadow Chancellor.
I've seen Shadow Ministers and indeed Ministers resign in all kinds of circumstances, expecting it to lead to some great political earthquake, and generally it doesn't.
Right, so no political earthquake. But let's have a look at the timings, because there have been claims from people here at the conference that it did look a little bit suspect, the timing of Andy McDonald's resignation. He signed up to party pledges on the minimum wage just at the weekend. Yesterday, his resignation came shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Within the hour, a Jeremy Corbyn op-ed had suddenly appeared in the newspaper. The title was "Keir Starmer wants to prop up the wealthy and powerful. Labour membership and trade unions are under attack because they want social change." Then, a few hours later, the left campaign group Momentum, who were sort of the founding group behind Jeremy Corbyn, was sharing a clip of Keir Starmer backing that £15 minimum wage. Then they tweeted out this: "We support the basics. How about you?" What would you say?
I think the left is clearly getting organised against Keir Starmer. And I don't think Andy McDonald's wrong to say that the movement is divided. But perhaps that's a good thing for the Labour leader, because he's had such an emphasis on unity over the past year that he's barely said anything. And actually, you know, if you are going to say something, you're going to make enemies.
Right, well, you know, maybe you do have to set up some sort of division and tension.
Well, I mean, division and tension is always what journalists like to report on, and have always reported on that both party.
Yeah, but what about what Isabel said, that he hasn't really said anything? So there wasn't really anything to fight against.
Who's not said anything?
Keir Starmer.
Well, Keir Starmer's backing my plan to double investment into dementia research. Did you know 1 in 3 people born this year will develop dementia, which is why we need to find a cure for dementia? That's what I'm talking about in my speech today. That's going to make a huge difference to people's lives.
All right. Also, the substance, though, of why Andy McDonald resigned, if we believe what he said, is important, isn't it? Because he said he resigned because he didn't want to go into a room, Jonathan Ashworth, and argue that the £15 minimum wage would not be put to a vote on the conference floor. Now, the Labour leadership have said they're relaxed about today's vote, but they didn't want it to go to a vote in the first place, did they?
Well, I don't know, because what we have at this conference, we have a very sort of can seem arcane, certainly bureaucratic process of compositing, where all the representatives come together. Well, it is happening. It is happening.
Yeah, but you know, they didn't want it to, did they?
It's not in the gift of the. It's neither in the gift of a shadow cabinet minister nor an advisor in the leader's office to block a vote on the conference floor. That's up to the conference to decide. So I'm not party to these conversations, but I don't really know what the background to it all is.
All right, well, as I say, let's focus on the substance of Andy McDonald's complaint, because this was the Labour MP Diane Abbott speaking on the Today programme earlier on.
There's no point clapping low-paid NHS or social care workers. You can't live on claps. And yes, I think you'll find a lot of constituency delegates support £15 an hour. It's the very least.
Right, do you support it? You've been talking about deserving health workers when you took to the conference stage, or the Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary. So you must want a £15 an hour minimum wage for care workers who've been putting their lives on the line.
I want to see care workers get an increase in their pay. I want to see them
£15 an hour.
I want to see them get a national living wage. I want to see it negotiated properly with the relevant bodies. But I tell you what,
what is that fair wage?
Well, if there was a general election tomorrow, we will have worked out and we'll have come forward with a detailed proposal on what it would be. At the last general election, we were talking about £10 an hour. And I remember, and I've got to say to Diane and some others, I remember sitting in the same shadow cabinet with Diane, and she knows that shadow ministers cannot make spending commitments all over the shop. We had to go into tough negotiations. I remember going into negotiations with John's team and getting knocked back on things I wanted to spend money on. In the 2019 general election, I didn't get the amount of money I wanted to spend on public health services, right? I wanted to go further. I'm not criticising them. That is what you do as a team. You have to decide what your priorities are, and these things always have to be decided in the round. And John and Diane know that because they went through that process in 2017 and 2019.
I mean, is it radical enough? Isabel, you said Keir Starmer hadn't really said enough in order for perhaps the left of the party to sort of push back on. Is this the moment that starts happening?
Well, in my view, it should be, in the sense, not that he's sort of picking fights with the left, but he definitely needs to define himself more. It's not clear even to people within the Labour Party what the party stands for, what it wants the economy to look like, even though we've had a Shadow Chancellor's speech. I think there's a lot of confusion within the movement about what Labour is saying and thinking, let alone in the wider public.
Right, because if I show our viewers this graph, the National Living Wage Forecast, I know it's a little bit small from where we're sitting, but let me just show, yes, there on the right, Jonathan. It's talking about what the Labour proposal would be, promising at least £10 an hour. Andy McDonald argued that Labour hadn't upgraded its minimum wage offer since 2014. If you look at where the national minimum wage is going to be, it's going to be at £10.33 anyway. I mean, couldn't you have been a bit more radical? You can understand why activists are disappointed.
Well, activists will always want us to go further, and quite rightly so, because we are a progressive party who is motivated by social change. But as we go into a general election, when that general election comes, we will outline how we are going to improve pay for low-paid people in this country, and we'll do it at the right moment.
Right, but at the moment it looks pretty similar to what's being forecast already.
Well, we've been talking about at least £10 an hour. You say it's been forecast. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, does it?
But it's only 33
That's not set in stone that that's going to happen.
No, absolutely. But at the moment, if you're saying to activists and the party faithful here, this is what we aspire to pay our health workers.
Well, I tell you what, though, I came to this conference in 1996. I was very young. I was a steward on the doors, and I remember a similar debate about the minimum wage. And we said very clearly that we would introduce a minimum wage, but we wouldn't set the terms of it in 1996. Activists were upset, but we won in 1997, and we implemented that national minimum wage.
Isabel?
I just think that there's still a fundamental problem with Labour, which is that it's not actually really talking to the public, it's talking to itself. And Andy McDonald's resignation has made that much harder. But also there's this fuel crisis going on, and it's barely been mentioned at conferences. I know conferences are a bubble, but this one has got very, very thick walls.
Right, we're going to talk about it in just a moment, but do you want to respond, first of all, to what Isabel said in terms of talking to the wider public about the economy?
It's inevitable that if a colleague resigns from the Shadow Cabinet, that the 7 or 8 minutes worth of the discussion is going to be focused on that. I've been around long enough to know that is an inevitable feature of how politics is reported on. Don't say that as a point of criticism, I just know it is what it is. But I have been talking today about children's health, about what we need to do around dementia, sketching out a future for social care services. So we are actually also talking about big policy changes.
Right, Isabel, can you just pick up, though, on what Jonathan did say about the sort of debates that you would have on something like pay if you get into government, or certainly in the run-up to getting into government? I mean, is this an attempt by the Labour Party to show fiscal restraint?
I think that's always something that the Labour Party is anxious to show, because that's one of its weaknesses, and something that over the past decade of opposition it's been struggling with. The accusations still from the Conservatives that Labour crashed the economy in 2008 and so on. And that's something that you're paying heed to. But I think there has been a change, because Boris Johnson, partly as a result of COVID, partly because he calls himself a Brexity Hezza, is much more prepared to spend money on big projects than previous.
I mean, it's like times that Johnson's almost fiscally incontinent at times, isn't he, with the spending commitments he throws around like confetti. But whether he actually delivers on that is a definite issue. That was quite a mixture of metaphors, wasn't it? But it's day 4, 3 of conference.
Yes, all right. We'll get work tomorrow.
But yeah, I mean, a party has to be able to show to the British people that we've got ideas that will change society, but we know how we're going to fund them, and that's part of politics.
All right.
And that was what John McDonald was trying to do with his team when he was the Shadow Chancellor. Stop me paying, pledging more on public health.
All right. Isabel, you mentioned, of course, the big story that is affecting millions of people, and that is the petrol crisis, the fuel delivery crisis. Let's just show everyone the front page of the Mirror. This is a suggestion that has been put forward by a number of people, but including the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey. Let all key workers fill up first. The GMB is saying the same thing, the big union. What say you, Jonathan?
I mean, I think we've got to look at this. I mean,
logistically,
you've got to think it through. How would you prove to the petrol station that you're a key worker? I mean, so there's some practical things that probably have to be thought through.
But in principle, do you think that should be a consideration?
I think we are heading into a crisis, potentially, if what we're reading is correct. And I think we really need to know what the government are going to do to get a grip of this. Because if we cannot get doctors and nurses and midwives and paramedics getting to the hospitals, or even going around... I mean, remember, a lot of healthcare staff, a lot of community nurses visit people every day or a couple of times a week. If those people on their own are not getting those visits, that's devastating. So we are going to have to look at something like this unless the government come forward with a more serious plan quickly.
You're going to look at it. What does that mean? Does that mean you would consider giving priority to key workers and health workers?
Well, yes, but I'm making a sort of practical... I'm just thinking it through the practicalities of it.
Sure.
I mean, does a nurse turn up at Esso and just sort of say, I'm a nurse, or do we have to give them some sort of special ID badge or something like that? There are probably practical things we need to think through, but the principle of it, this will be a disaster if NHS care staff cannot get to their patients because of lack of petrol.
Is this something you're going to take up?
Well, I'm taking it up now with you, so yes.
Isabel?
I think Labour's been quite flat-footed on this, actually. I think it should have dominated the conference much more than it has. And I think, you know, the party's slogan this week, in case anyone's missed it, is Stronger Future Together. But I think the slogan that we hear the most from the party is there should have been a plan for this, on like everything. And I know that's partly because there should have been a plan for lots of things that Boris Johnson hasn't enacted, hasn't worked on. But it is starting to sound a little bit like his attack, Captain Hindsight, probably has a little bit of truth in it about Keir Starmer.
Well, I'm sure that Keir Starmer will be saying more about it today and tomorrow. He's got his big speech tomorrow as well. But we have got to, I mean, look, it would be an absolute disaster if nurses and midwives and doctors cannot get to the bedsides of their patients. And I appreciate you're maybe becoming rather hackneyed with or fed up with the hackneyed phrase, we need a plan. But my God, ministers need to get a grip.
Right. I mean, in terms then of what you're going to do to progress this, there are already complaints from health workers that they can't get to work and care workers. Do you think there should be more intervention by the opposition, more muscular, as Isabel is saying, on this issue?
Well, yes. And one of the issues I think is that it's the sort of Isabel's part about this. Everything's sort of in conference. If we weren't at conference, we'd all be in Parliament, dragging ministers to the House of Commons to answer for this, and ministers would be going around broadcast studios answering on it. I think you're right. We do need to focus on this because I'm very worried about what this means for the delivery of healthcare. All
right, we're going to take a pause there, and thank you to both of you. There is a documentary on next week, which of course you'll all want to see, a BBC documentary on Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the Blair and Brown years. We're going to play you an extract from that, and Tony Blair is talking about what sort of drove him in terms of New Labour.
For me, the central guiding belief of New Labour was that if you wanted to create a more just society, it wasn't simply about transferring money from the more wealthy to the poorer parts of society. All of that has its place and is important, but if you wanted to transform people's lives, then it wasn't just about investment in public services, it was about deep structural reform. He was more traditionally thinking about, you know, the basic Labour support. I mean, the reality is with me and Gordon, yes, I was always more on the aspirational, how do you make sure that that group of working class voters that deserted to Maggie Thatcher in the 80s came with Labour. Those were more, in a sense, my folk.
So that is Blair and Brown, the New Labour revolution. It starts on Monday, the 4th of October, 9 o'clock on BBC Two, and all episodes will be available on BBC iPlayer from Monday, the 4th of October. Time to welcome my next guests. We have Charles Clarke, former Cabinet Minister during the Tony Blair years, and Richard Bergen, former Shadow Cabinet Minister under Jeremy Corbyn and Secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Does that still hold true, Charles, what Tony Blair was talking about? What drove him in terms of trying to transform politics was this issue of aspiration?
It's still a fundamental point. Interestingly, Wes Streeting, when he was speaking to the conference this morning, made the, I think, true point that aspiration isn't a middle-class value. It's been a working-class value through life as people from all kinds of backgrounds want to move on. And the question, the challenge for Labour politicians is how to ensure that people from every kind of background can move on in their life through education, health and so on in whatever way.
Is Keir Starmer doing that?
I think he is, actually, and I think you saw it yesterday in Rachel Reeves' speech, which I thought was an excellent speech, to the party conference, where she touched a number of those buttons.
Right, well, what about that issue of aspiration? Isn't that what is a sort of connecting factor between different groups of people?
Well, the whole history of the Labour Party has been about trying to empower people to have a better living standard and advance the living standards of working class people so they can fulfil their potential. So, of course, that's very important, you know, whoever the leader is. But in the current economic circumstances we're in, it's even more important because people have had it tougher now than they've had for a long time. It's to be putting out those policies which really defend and advance living standards.
And is Keir Starmer doing that?
I think he needs to do much more to do that. We need many more bread and butter policies announcing, and he could start off by pushing the 10 pledges that he made to party members when he got elected.
Right, well, this editorial by Jeremy Corbyn here with the headline in the eye, Keir Starmer wants to prop up the wealthy and the powerful. Labour membership and trade unions are under attack because they want social change. Is he right?
Well, Keir's got to prove the doubters wrong on Wednesday.
Yeah, but do you agree with that? Is he propping up the wealthy and the powerful?
Well, unless we take on the vested interests, then in essence we're leaving the status quo as it is. And the status quo we've got is seeing tens of thousands of people in our country having died unnecessarily during COVID. It's seeing people worried about living standards. 500,000 going to be pushed into poverty by the universal credit cut, the national insurance hike. So we need to be doing things like boosting the minimum wage, like pushing forward a green industrial revolution to create hundreds of thousands of green, well-paid, unionised jobs.
I don't know where Jeremy Corbyn's coming from. I wasn't at his speech. I've only seen that report, Joe, that you've just shown us. I don't know if it was accurate. But coming directly after Keir has made a speech saying you should remove charitable status from public schools, so they've got to pay VAT and all the rest of it, to describe him as propping up the wealthy and powerful when he's taking away a foundation of the ability of the wealthy and powerful to replicate themselves, I just think he's completely missing the point.
The truth is, unfortunately, that many people are feeling out there in the country that millions of people looking to the Labour leadership to be their voice, that the Labour leadership hasn't spelt out exactly what it stands for.
But is that a good example of doing it?
Has been policy light so far. Politics doesn't stop during a crisis. Politics intensifies through a crisis. So I think now is the time, it's well overdue, to really push forward with practical policies like a wealth tax, for example. A wealth tax to fund a national care service. We need to be more specific now, in my opinion.
The fundamental thing, Joe, is if you're going to, as Richard rightly says, if you're going to underpin people's ability to get out of the economic and social crises they're in, that means putting in comprehensive under-fives provision for children, for example. It means establishing a proper social care system, which John Ashworth was talking about this morning. Those are fundamental things. That's the way to talk about it, rather than simply saying, let's have a pop at the existing wealthy in society.
I mean, a lot of activists here do feel betrayed, Charles. I mean, that's not unique, but they do claim that over issues like public ownership, for example, Keir Starmer said one thing to get elected as the Labour Party leader and is now abandoning those pledges. Isn't that a problem?
If it were true, it would be a problem. I don't know if it is true, actually, that particular point. But the key question...
Well, it is, because he certainly pledged that he supported public ownership of utilities, the main utilities, and now...
Here we have the extraordinary thing this morning of the Conservative government putting a utility into public ownership this morning, South East Railways, taking over the nationalising South East Railways. Public ownership isn't the be-all and end-all. The quality of delivery of service to the society is what's important.
Isn't that true?
Well, we saw the clip from Tony Blair earlier. Obviously, I don't come from the wing of the party that Tony Blair came from, but nobody could accuse Tony Blair in the run-up to the 1997 election of not taking the fight to the Tories. And many Labour members, trade unionists and Labour supporters actually think that during the crisis, the leadership has let the Tories off the hook. And it isn't a good look, Joe. It isn't a good look, not in the country, not to be seen to be honouring your promises.
Charles?
Well, it's every Labour Party conference I've been to, Joe, many more than I would like to say, has the sense of disappointed expectation amongst some members, hoping exactly as Richard says that the leadership at the time would have done more. That's what happens. Other people saying we've got to keep doing more. That's the tension of the discussion that goes on. I'd be with those who say, yes, more has to be done. There's no question about it, both to take the fight to the Tories and to present our alternative approach over time. But that's the thing that has to do to change it and move it on.
Right. I mean, Richard, you would accept that the radical agenda that you support, and you supported in 2017 and 2019, was rejected wholeheartedly by voters. And so why are activists trying to force the leadership to accept policies that didn't win over voters?
Well, partly because the policies that Keir was promising were policies from the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. I want to say, though, of course, the 2019 election was a Brexit election, but I want to congratulate Charles as well for the important role he played in the electoral advance, the electoral triumph in 1997. But since then, Joe, the only time we've gained more MPs in a general election was actually 2017. So I counsel the Labour leadership to look at 2017, the only general election for 20 years where we've made an advance in the number of MPs, and think, what can we learn from that to take it further? It wasn't enough. 40% of the vote wasn't enough. 3 million extra votes wasn't enough. 30 extra MPs wasn't enough. But what can we learn from the positives of that 2017 general election?
I don't think Richard would agree with what I'm about to say. I believe in 2017 we did relatively better because most people in the country believed Jeremy Corbyn hadn't got a chance of being Prime Minister, so could give us the vote without risking it happening. When that was changed in 2019, when they realised there might be a chance, we got the result that we did. The fundamental thing is to put forward a coherent approach to running the country in a better way.
Right. I mean, Andy McDonald resigned over a touchstone issue of raising the national minimum wage to £15 an hour, which Keir Starmer said he backed. Can you again see why people here would be angry about that?
Well, it's interesting you use that phrase, Joe, a touchstone issue. I wouldn't see that as a touchstone issue.
No?
The establishment of the minimum wage most certainly was a touchstone issue, something that Tony Blair's government did in that period. The question at what level it's set isn't the decisive question at any given time. You want to make sure that platform is in there and to raise it up, what's going on. But to make it a symbol, if I can put it like that, £15, not £10 or whatever, I don't think the right way to proceed at all in considering those kind of discussions.
Well, what do you say to that?
I think one of the main issues was that everyone was surprised when Andy McDonald, as Shadow Employment Rights Secretary, was instructed to go into that meeting and not build the case for a £15 an hour minimum wage.
He'd agreed to the raft of employment package, hadn't he, at the weekend, though? He signed up to what...
But he was instructed to go in and demolish the case for a £15 an hour minimum wage. The unions have made a very persuasive case, and they're the experts in this, on how the people who've got us through this pandemic have really been struggling, and it's £15 an hour that they need. And who would have thought that Andy would have been instructed and expected to go in and argue against it, to go in and try and demolish that case, and as well the case in relation to statutory sick pay at a real living wage.
This is naive in the extreme with respect, Richard, because everybody in a collective leadership, whether in opposition or in government, broadly has to stick to the same economic line, the line that was set out by Rachel Reeves yesterday in her speech to the conference. And that's about being prudent with the people's money. She was very clear about that and got a lot of support in the conference hall for saying that. That means that whether you take a decision about the minimum wage of £10, £12, £15 or whatever it is, that has to be within that overall team constraint. Now, Andy obviously felt he couldn't accept that. Fine, he decided to resign, his decision. But at the end of the day, when you were in the shadow cabinet, you were operating the same as when I was in the cabinet. You have to accept a general collective discipline in a political party for putting your case around the overall central economic strategy.
Well, you were there. You were in the shadow cabinet. We've just had Jonathan Ashworth say he actually asked for money from John McDonnell, the former shadow chancellor, and he said no, but he didn't resign.
Well, of course, Charles is correct that, collective responsibility exists.
Well, where was it then in this case?
But this really was something that shouldn't have happened, whereby he was instructed to go and try and demolish this case.
Is it any different, Richard, to the sorts of examples we've just heard from Charles and Jonathan Ashworth saying that he was asking for things that he couldn't get through John McDonnell?
It is different. For example, the TUC supports a policy of statutory sick pay at real living wage levels. Andy was instructed to go into this meeting and try and demolish the case, both for the £15 an hour minimum wage and that statutory sick pay. And that was to ask Andy to betray his principles, which he would never have done.
Right, all right. Well, gosh, God forbid that a politician should betray their principles at any point. Let's just show our viewers this in the Guardian newspaper. This is about another important area, certainly for Keir Starmer. As he said, he wants to focus on security. The headline says Labour evokes Blair's tough on crime slogan in bid to take on Tories. Party to unveil raft of policies and accuse Priti Patel of being soft on crime, soft on the causes of crime. Is this music to your ears, Charles?
Well, I always thought that fantastic. It is really, but I always thought that slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, was a brilliant slogan because it summed up the twin challenges, that you have to be straightforward on it, but you have to acknowledge that crime doesn't come out of a blue sky. I think Priti Patel's been exceptionally weak on crime and on dealing with the causes of crime. And in a sense, she needs to be held to account. And I think this slogan will do that. Right.
What do you think? When you heard those words, did you think, oh, yippee?
Well, the Guardian headline we've just seen only includes part of the quote. It says, tough on crime. As Charles said, it was also tough on the causes of crime. Yeah. I think Priti Patel has been very hardline on the rhetoric. She'd been doing a lot of posturing to try and whip up antagonism.
What about Labour? Nick Thomas-Symonds is using that, the Shadow Home Secretary, using that phrase. Is that a phrase you'd like to see return?
Well, we also need to be talking about being tough on the causes of crime and also putting forward the case for rehabilitation and the fact, for example, that filling our prisons with more and more people for non-violent, non-sexual crimes actually increases reoffending rates and actually makes society less safe. So I think we need a logical, hard, sober look at how the criminal justice system is working, because it's clearly not working. We don't want to get into an arms race with the Tories about who can put more people in prison.
I basically agree with Richard on this. When I was Home Secretary, I tried to reduce the number of people in prison. I think I didn't agree with Michael Howard's famous slogan, prison works. I don't believe prison does work. I think it's much more like prisons as universities for crime. And so you've got to think how to bring it down. But, and this is the core point, it's a very tough thing to do. And I think Labour does need in this not only to look at the tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, but to see how you increase the return to criminality of people in prison, how you reduce that.
You were something of a firebrand yourself, of course,
A firebrand?
Charles. Yes.
Joe, that's so exciting. You've never said that to me before.
Well, there you go. You can go away from this conference a happy man. But in that sense, and in the spirit of activists here, do you appreciate that that's really just history repeating itself? That's what activists do. They hold leadership's feet to the fire.
Of course, and so they should. I've never been one who votes for the leadership, for the platform in this situation. You want to have people determined, angry, firebrands, if that's the word you want to use.
And then ignore them.
Well, you don't ignore them, actually. I think what people tend to portray it like that, but it's not true of any leadership. I think the characterisations have to be right. That's why I think that Jeremy Corbyn's idea that Keir is somehow standing up for the wealthy and powerful in Britain is such complete nonsense. You can argue he maybe not be doing enough. Let's have that discussion. But if you mischaracterise what Keir is trying to do, as Jeremy Corbyn did in that quote you gave us, it's a fundamental error.
Complete nonsense by Jeremy Corbyn, that quote.
I think the full article is worth reading, including by Keir Starmer.
Including, but I see, for him to read it, you mean?
I think it's an article that everyone should read, including Keir Starmer.
Richard Bergen, thank you very much, and to you, Charles Clarke.
Thank you,
now, we're going to go back to that story, of course, that has been the backdrop, if you like, to this conference, and that's the fuel crisis. Very little petrol at so many pumps, queues around the country as the shortage of HGV drivers means fuel isn't being delivered to petrol stations. The question is, how long is the situation going to last? We've already talked about the issue of key workers, or a proposal of key workers unable to get to their jobs because their cars have literally run out of fuel. The army, we understand, is being held in reserve. And that issue, as I say, of key workers, the Labour Party said under Jonathan Ashworth that they could well discuss it. Let's see what the government has been saying about it, because they were silent, but let's hear what they've been saying. Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, has done an interview. Here he is.
Very tentative signs of stabilisation in the forecourt storage, which won't be reflected in the queues as yet, but it's the first time we've seen more petrol in the petrol stations itself. I think, as the industry said yesterday, the sooner we can all return to our normal buying habits, the sooner the situation will return to normal.
Well, that was Grant Shapps there. Let me welcome Steve Reed, Shadow Communities Secretary, and Trevor Kavanagh, political columnist at The Sun. Listening there to what the government was saying, Trevor, I'm going to show the front page of The Sun newspaper. Unsurprisingly, they're leading with this issue. The headline says, "Q what? Government asleep at the wheel." You're not impressed with the government?
Not at the moment, and I don't think many people are. And I think it's a very powerful message to the government that particularly our readers, who are often the drivers and the tanker drivers and the white van man who need to be on the road perhaps more than others, are getting fed up with this. And I think it's a perfect opportunity for an opposition to get back into the game and attack.
Right, so you don't think Labour's been doing enough then to actually hold the government to account on this either?
It hasn't actually dominated the news so far. It hasn't taken the command centre stage on the subject.
Steve?
Well, I'm pleased to see it on the front of your paper there, Trevor. But, I mean, the situation is the government has caused this crisis by their own inaction. So we have 100,000 shortage of HGV drivers at the moment. They've known this from even before Brexit, so you can't even pin it down on just Brexit, and they've done nothing about it. They could have added HGV drivers onto the skills shortage list and made sure that visas were given to people to come in and carry out this work. That would have got petrol to the petrol stations. It would have guaranteed fruit and vegetables getting to the supermarkets. They didn't do it. For very bizarre, ideological, knee-jerk reasons, they've decided to let the country run out of petrol.
Right.
Britain in 2021, we can't get petrol.
So why is it not centre stage here, that issue? Why has Labour not had big signs, posters at petrol stations, emblazoning everywhere across every part of your party conference on the basis of what you just said?
We're talking about an awful lot of things, as you know, at a
of course,
party conference.
but if this is the issue, if you think it is the defining issue for now...
It is for today. I mean, we've been talking an awful lot about the cost of living crisis that is clobbering people right across the board. This is one facet of that.
Right. Do you agree that Labour has been doing quite a lot around cost of living, if not specifically yet on this issue?
Well, this is the issue of the moment. The cost of living is also an issue, I agree. And I was beginning to agree with Steve in the beginning of what he was listing of the problems that have caused this driver shortage. But when he got to the point of saying that this is caused by ideological reasons of leaving Britain short of petrol, I'm afraid that's where I lost. I lost it.
Right.
I think that there are a raft of reasons, and it's been a problem when it comes to heavy goods vehicle drivers for more than a decade. And all across the world, it's a problem. It's not just this government, certainly not for ideological reasons.
If I can say why I think it's ideological, because they've actually had a split in the cabinet about whether they need to issue more than 5,000 work permits for people to come in and drive the HGV lorries. We've got a shortage of 100,000. Is it incompetence or is it blind ideology? Whichever it is, the problem is caused by Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak sat in Downing Street. They could resolve it today if they wanted to.
The problem is caused by companies failing to train and pay properly the people they need to drive.
The drivers aren't here. They're not here.
No, because but not just because of Brexit.
So there's a short-term element to this and a long-term element.
The shortage is not something to do with either Brexit in any serious measure
and I've said
or the
that.
Pandemic.
I said that.
Well, I mean, you did mention Brexit. You said it was only in part to blame. It's very clear here in the Guardian. Well, Brexit to blame for UK's fuel crisis, says frontrunner to succeed Merkel, talking about Olaf Scholz there. Is he right?
That's interesting that that's his view, but the government could have put HGV drivers on the skills shortage list and made sure enough work permits were given to overseas drivers to come here and do the job. They didn't. They chose not to. Deliberate.
What does Steve need to do? What does the Labour Party need to say to appear in the Sun newspaper on the front page?
Well, I think the Labour Party has to remember that only in 2017 it had the support of 39% of our readers. That has completely plummeted in the meantime to whatever it was that led to the election of Boris Johnson with an 80-seat majority. And I think it has to address the fact that it needs our readers before it can ever hope to win an election.
Yeah, well, I agree with some of Trevor there. You know, it's less than 2 years ago we suffered our worst election defeat for 85 years. Catastrophic. This conference has been about doing two things. One, changing the rules of the Labour Party that caused us to look inwards and not outwards to voters. And two, starting to focus on the priorities that matter to the British people. So the cost of living crisis right now, escalating gas prices, escalating food prices, incomes being cut, universal credit being removed this week, national insurance tax being raised and used to clobber working people by the Conservatives. That is the bread and butter of politics today. That is what we've been talking about.
But you want to raise money to provide for social care, and you're not prepared to say you would revoke the national insurance contributions. Money has to be raised. Rachel Reeves has said that she's going to raise an enormous, nearly 250 billion for different subjects. But you need the money from somewhere. Where are you going to get it from?
No, I agree with that. The problem I've got with this government is that their impulse is always to turn to working families first of all and clobber them. So, for instance, Keir said this himself before, but if you are a landlord renting out a portfolio of properties, you don't pay a penny more towards social care. But if you are a care worker on £18,000 a year renting one of the landlord's flats, you will be clobbered. Now, that doesn't strike me as fair. We have to share the burden out fairly across everybody, and just because you're wealthy shouldn't mean that you get off without paying extra taxes.
I don't think that the wealthy do get off without paying.
That's exactly what the government's doing.
Well, can I go back to the issue of the working families, as you're talking about people who can't get petrol at the moment and they are queuing up. What would Labour do in these circumstances? Would you call in the army?
Well, there's a short-term and a long-term problem here, and we need to address both of them.
But right now, what would you do?
Right now, we would make sure that the permit... We would have done it a few weeks ago, to be honest. I can't believe the government hasn't. But you would issue more work permits to bring in the
Would you issue 100,000 visas to foreign workers for them to come
and issue
and
the number that is required? You need a dramatically bigger number than 5,000. Temporary work permits to let people come in so that those lorries that are not being driven can be driven. More than 5,000.
But less than 100,000?
That would be for a negotiation between the sector and the government. I don't think I'm in a position to answer the precise number, but dramatically more than 5,000.
And you'd still be in favour of increasing pay, for example, for HGV
I think
drivers?
that's the short-term aspect of it. Long-term, you have to invest in training up more British drivers so that they're able to drive that. And I think there are issues about terms and conditions and pay. So, for instance...
Issues, you say, but what does that mean? That's very opaque. Do you think they should be paid more, and that would improve the situation?
They're currently about to be paid less because the government's national insurance tax hike will clobber HGV drivers, so their take-home pay is going down. So we can't have that.
Well, that's true.
Well, they're currently about to be paid a lot more, as I understand it. They're being offered substantial pay rises, which they, if I may say so, richly deserve, and they deserve a lot better conditions. Now, this is nothing to do with the government whatsoever. This is down to the haulage contractors and the supermarkets and the petrol companies who are underpaying a group of workers who have rather difficult working conditions. And that's been the situation for a long time. It's not necessarily political. The latest crisis is partly caused by the fact that they're not getting the tests through quickly. They're not being accelerated. There are ways in which we could use British labour instead of importing other labour from other countries.
That's why I'm really pleased that we've proposed fair pay agreements, sector by sector, that will set minimum terms and conditions and pay in each sector, including this one. So
this is
great to hear that the editor of the Sun's
to do with competition, and the cheap labour from abroad has been the reason why British lorry drivers are not being paid enough.
Well, let me intervene here because we have an update, breaking news, as we call it in the trade. Alex Wickham, journalist, has said, told Keir Starmer held a Zoom call with Ed Miliband and business, the fuel industry, this morning, asking them what they want government to do about the crisis that we are talking about in terms of intervening. Then lists a whole list of companies, hospitality, trade unions on the call too. Expect Labour leader to go big on what they told him. Does that actually make you think, oh, OK, finally they're getting a grip of this?
I'm not quite sure what exactly that's going to result in. Industry leaders, are they going to be responding to a party of opposition? I don't know. It's the government that should be dealing with this, not the Labour
Just
Party.
a minute ago, you said you wanted us saying more, and now you're saying we shouldn't be saying anything because we're the opposition.
No, I didn't say you shouldn't be saying. I'm
delighted Keir Starmer's doing what the government's not doing and talking to the sector
I'm very
to
happy
find the
if you'd be
solutions
saying
and
something.
pitch them and hope the government will follow suit.
Just briefly before we move on, key workers, should they get priority at the pumps?
I mean, if we're in a position in Britain in 2021 where you're having to ration petrol because of the government's incompetence, then yes, you have to prioritise people who are doing jobs that matter most to the health and well-being of the country.
All right. Another issue that might appeal to Trevor's readers, we talked about Labour getting tough on crime. The Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas Simmons, will be setting out Labour's views on crime and punishment later. The headline announcement is a police hub in every neighbourhood. What's a police hub?
It's it will be a hub where you will locate police, but also other people, an additional number of special constables, youth workers, noise nuisance teams. So a single location where the public can go to get support.
Everywhere, what, in wards, in council areas?
Well, that's to be agreed. We're not going to just impose them on every community. We'll talk to our colleagues in local governments to achieve that. But currently, you don't see police out and about on the street because the Conservatives have cut them, and then those that remain are stuck behind their desks carrying out paperwork. That's no good.
More bobbies on the beat. Lots of people like the sound of that.
And more special constables.
How many? How much will it cost?
Well, the Conservatives cut 21,000 police after they came into power.
So you're going to put those back?
There's still a shortage of 8,000, so we will complete the re-recruitment of the officers that the Conservatives got rid of. But we're also going to recruit an additional 5,000 special constables who are volunteers, a bit like PCSOs, who work alongside the police and can be a visible uniform presence on the high street.
I mean, I've read some of the briefing around his speech, Nick Thomas Simmons, and it means that children won't have to be scared at bus stops. I mean, are we talking about a bobby literally on every street corner here?
Well, I think if you've got more police out and about on the streets, that's a more visible police presence and it's reassuring. But let me give you an example from my own constituency.
But it will cost quite a lot of money, and people, again, I know you're in opposition, will want to know where that's coming from.
Special constables actually don't cost that much more. It's just the cost of training and buying their uniforms. It's relatively low. Part of this is about making sure the police are out there on the streets, not stuck behind their desks, and it's partly about putting back the police. The Conservatives cut, then said they'd bring back, but actually haven't brought back.
Do you like the sound of that?
It all sounds very nice, but I've heard it all before, and so have you, and so has Steve. What we need is police actually out there to do the job of policing. So they will pursue the burglaries instead of just ignoring the calls from people have been burgled. And instead of dancing with protesters, they actually round them up and stop them blocking motorways.
I'll give the example in my constituency. We've got a group of lads going and racing their cars on the streets in a residential area. There are no police to come and stop them. It's not acceptable.
All right, that's all we have time for. I'm going to stop these two here, but thank you to both of you. I will be back tomorrow right here at 11:15. Bye-bye.